Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, we're going to talk all about the Anthony Edwards extension. He's locked up for 5 more years after this one. Want to hit some of the high points there, plus the impact of the new additions, the signings from Friday when free agency opened on the Wolves rotation, and ultimately, what's that impact on Kyle Anderson, who was one of the Wolves' best players last season, arguably the best free agent signing in Wolves history. What's his role this season? We're going to break it all down on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Tuesday, everybody. Happy 4th of July. Happy Independence Day in the United States. Hopefully you're having a fantastic holiday weekend. And hopefully we're able to extend that weekend through Monday and into today. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at PrizePicks. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. That's prizepicks.com, promo code Locked On. A big thank you, first of all, for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. You can find this one. You can also watch the show on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken. That's with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. All right, so today, we have to start with the Anthony Edwards extension. Obviously, that's the big news from Monday, kind of midday Monday. It was reported, I think Adrian Wojnarowski, Shams Charania, and then also John Krasinski locally all had it at about the same time. Ant's agent confirmed it with a statement. The team has not, as of this recording, announced that it is for sure happening, but we know that it is based on Ant and his agent and all these fine reporters that have reported the news. So it's a 5-year maximum extension for Anthony Edwards. I'm just going to hit this real quick. There really isn't a whole lot to say other than congrats to Ant, congrats to the Wolves, congrats to all of us who follow the team, cover the team, who are fans of the team. This was a really, it was going to happen. But, 3 years ago, maybe coming out of his rookie season, maybe there could have been some, or I guess that would have been 2 years ago, with the Gerson Rosas was in charge at the time. That summer, the Wolves were a disaster. Rosas leaving, and then eventually Saunders being fired. Then, or actually, I got that backwards. Saunders being fired, Finch coming, then Rosas leaving. Just the disaster of that summer. Fast forward to now, 5-year max deal. It's at least 220 million, up to 260, depending on if he makes an All-NBA team, and then some other incentives in there. But if he makes an All-NBA team this season, that ratchets up the total earning potential of the deal. So good on Ant to get it done. Also, or to land the deal. Also, important to point out that there is no option at all on this deal. So the Timberwolves do not need to worry about a player option in year 5, like we've seen some teams have to fork over to get a deal done. It's in line with the Pacers extending Tyrese Haliburton and the Hornets extending LaMelo Ball. Same idea, right? So it's that so-called, I think it's the Rose extension, essentially. So it could be up to 30% of the team's cap, up to that $260 million versus 25% of regular max. And we've seen some players sign those here recently. I'm blanking on who just did the other day. It's escaping me. But anyway, good on Ant, good on the Wolves to get this done. All really positive news. Some other minor Timberwolves notes to get out of the way because they're minor in the scheme of the team, but they're national tidbits that have the Wolves involved. Karl-Anthony Towns, or I should say the Damian Lillard trade request is now a thing. And of course, there were a number of teams that have checked in, and Chris Haynes was out there talking about several teams that had checked in on him, including the Pelicans, Celtics, obviously Miami. We know Dame wants to go to Miami. He also mentioned the Timberwolves, but said that the idea of a cat trade for Damian Lillard was quickly eliminated by the Blazers. And apparently there'd been some reporting to suggest that Dame had said he didn't want to play with Cat anyway. I can't recall where I saw that, that's important who sourced that, but somebody had said that out there. So all that to say, really unlikely, well less than a 1% chance that there's any sort of a trade for Damian Lillard. So I don't want to spend any more time on that. I don't think it's realistic. But until a Dame trade happens, I guess it's still technically possible. It just seems really, really unlikely. But just know the Wolves checked in, which is, what they need to do. Also, the Timberwolves hired an assistant coach. This was actually before free agency, but it just with everything going on late last week, I didn't get to. But Corliss Williamson, of course, longtime NBA player who had been an assistant a couple of times with, I think, 2 different stints with Sacramento, which is where he spent a lot of his career, among other places. He'd coached high school, he'd coached college, but he's been out of the league for a couple of years. Corliss Williamson has apparently been added to Chris Finch's staff. No news yet on what exactly the staff looks like next year. So not sure if there's just another coach or if somebody's leaving, but we'll cover all that when we get closer to training camp. So those are kind of the quick hitters off the top. The big news still is the free agency signings from last Friday, re-signing Nickeil Alexander-Walker to the 2-year deal, and then signing Troy Brown Jr. and signing Shake Milton to 2-year contracts each with team options, actually, for both of those, for Shake Milton and for Troy Brown Jr. in year 2. The Alexander-Walker deal is just a straight 2 for – it was 9 for him and 10 for Milton and 2 for 8 for Troy Brown. So again, value signings for the Wolves. And I talked about this a lot on Monday's show. So if you missed Monday, go back and listen to it. I talked pretty extensively about the value of the contracts and also backfilling some of the things that are missing when you let Taurean Prince and ultimately Jaylen Noel go. Of course, Prince already with the Lakers. Noel's still an unrestricted free agent, but he won't be back. The Wolves backfilled some of that defense, and I would argue improved defensively, certainly subtracting Noel and adding in a couple of I would say plus defenders in Troy Brown and I guess re-adding Nickeil Alexander-Walker. And even if Shake Milton's not a plus defender, he's better than Jaylen Noel, which isn't a very high bar, frankly. But the Wolves improved defensively. They improved their rebounding. They, at the very least, kind of stayed flat with their shooting, right? Noel was if you take those 5 players, and it's not this clean, but like if you want to just look at it this way, take those 5 players, right? Prince and Noel are gone. Alexander-Walker stays. You add Milton and Brown, and Noel's the worst shooter of the 5. He's the worst defender of the 5. You've upgraded that spot, right? I think that's all really important. I also want to point out here, before we get too deep into the actual roles, along those lines, not only did the Wolves improve in these categories, shooting, defense, or at least stayed flat, but I would argue improved shooting, overall, improved defensively, improved on the glass. They improved their overall depth by getting rid of 2 guys and bringing in 3, right, who are all better than Noel. Also, if you go back and look at the lineup data from last year, 22 of the Timberwolves' worst 25 3-man lineups, any 3-man lineup that played at least 20 minutes together, which is a little arbitrary, but like you could, play with that number in either direction and come up with a similar conclusion. But I sorted 3-man lineups net rating at stats.nba.com. 20 minutes or more for a 3-man lineup. 22 of the 25 worst 3-man lineups. I'm not even talking 5-man lineups. 3-man lineups involve players that just aren't on the team anymore. That is a huge win. It's maybe not surprising, but like you go on down the list, there's a lot of Bryn Forbes there. Obviously, he was really bad before the Wolves waived him midseason. A lot of Jaylen Noel in there. In fact, 5 of the bottom 6 lineups all involve Jaylen Noel, and 4 of the bottom 6 involve Bryn Forbes. But like some of these lineups also have Anthony Edwards, right? Because we're just talking about lineups that the Wolves played a lot of minutes with. So there's some in here that had Ant. There's some in here that had McDaniels. There's some in here that had Towns. There's some that have Gobert. But and I say that to point out that like these aren't simply like blowout lineups, garbage time lineups. These are just lineups that were used a bunch throughout the season. But 22 of the worst 25 all had at least one player that we know won't be back with the team last year. A lot of, I said a lot of Noel, a lot of Forbes, a decent amount of D'Angelo Russell, a little bit of Taurean Prince. So the Wolves have already improved those roles. And you can't sit here. I mean, like Taurean Prince is a good player. I'm not at all diminishing what Taurean Prince did with the Wolves. But some of the guys that won't be back were not good. Jaylen Noel, Bryn Forbes. I mean, those would be the 2 most obvious ones. Austin Rivers is another name that you see a lot on these lineups. And they've already improved them with players that were better than those guys last year. And Troy Brown Jr., Shake Milton, both good players on good teams. Philadelphia, a really good team in the regular season. Obviously had some playoff success too. Troy Brown Jr., in and out of the lineup, streaky, sure. But the Lakers also were streaky throughout the year, but they finished in the conference finals, right? So 2 players that played rotation minutes for much of the season on good teams that are upgrades over Bryn Forbes, Austin Rivers, Jaylen Noel, and to a lesser extent, you could argue of all those players, Taurean Prince is the best all-around player. You could make that argument. But again, collectively, the depth piece the depth piece is the overall improvement that the Wolves roster is undergoing with these moves. That matters. I want to talk a little bit more about that. And then I want to get specifically into the Kyle Anderson role and what this rotation could look like for Chris Finch as we move into the season. So we'll do that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors over at PrizePicks. If you're not familiar with PrizePicks, it's really easy to play. It's the best daily fantasy site that's out there. You just pick 2 to 6 players, and if they'll score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, it's not just basketball. It's really any sport. So, I mean, WNBA. I should say it's not just NBA. It's also WNBA, college basketball when it's ongoing. Baseball, like call it really any college sports, disc golf, European basketball, you name it, it's at PrizePicks. You can win up to 25 times your money, and you're not competing against other people either. It's just you versus the projections available. Entries can be made in less than 60 seconds. It really is that easy. Download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, they'll give you $50. Don't forget to enter the promo code Locked On at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. All right, a reminder to everydayers. First of all, a big thank you to everydayers, but we're still daily throughout the month of July, and that, of course, includes the rest of this week. We'll talk Summer League later in the week. I still want to talk a little more draft, rookies at least, and I guess Summer League will give us the chance to do that. But some more stuff that I've kind of dug up on Leonard Miller and what a steal a lot of people think he is. We didn't really get a chance because we launched right into free agency last week, so I want to do a little more of that and talk about the Wolves Summer League entry as well. So that'll be a big bulk of the next couple of weeks. But anyway, we're still daily throughout the month of July. So a big thank you to those that are on board daily. All right. Continuing the conversation about the Timberwolves depth and how it's improved. Again, 22 of the Wolves' worst 25 three-man lineups involve guys that we know will not be on the team again next year. And I've said this before, but the difference, I said this a lot last summer, the difference between bad, like below average, bad to average and passable is very similar to average, the difference between average and very good or great, right? Now, there's exceptions, of course, like generational players that's an outlier, right? That's by definition, that's what they are. They're a generational player, they're an outlier. But if you look at like everybody else in the league and you go from unplayable guys who are having to play as your 7th, 8th, 9th guy in the rotation and replace them with solid NBA caliber, rotation caliber players that deserve to see the floor for a contending team, that difference is effectively the same as going from solid players to really good players. And the Wolves, I would argue, are doing that. Now, but coming into last season, here's the problem is nothing ever plays out exactly like you think it's going to on paper, right? Coming into last season, we thought Jalen Noel was an above average rotation player based on what he had done the year prior. We were wrong. I was wrong. Jalen Noel was not good last season. There's no two ways about that. But removing his minutes and removing any minutes that were played, and I know Bryn Forbes and Austin Rivers were effectively 10th, 11th, 12th guys, depending on time of year on the roster anyway. Like they weren't supposed to be seeing rotation minutes. They were still depth guys forced into rotation minutes, replacing them with the likes of Shake Milton, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Troy Brown Jr., and then elevating guys who I would project out to be better just by virtue of their athleticism and activity level, like a Josh Minott or potentially Leonard Miller, potentially Wendell Moore Jr. These guys are all going to be upgrades over what the Wolves trotted out last season at the end of their bench or really kind of that mid-end of bench. The guys who, in a perfect world, are getting a DNP CD or just playing garbage time minutes. But over the course of the season, Mike Conley's going to sit out 10, 15 games at least. Ant's going to probably sit out a couple of games. Rudy's going to sit out a couple of games here and there. You're going to have bumps and bruises. Kyle Anderson has back spasms, right? How many games did he miss last year? Like you need this depth, even if they're not part of your typical 10-man rotation. Because I said this on Monday's show, your rotation, Mike Conley, Anthony Edwards, Jaden McDaniels, Karl-Anthony Towns, Rudy Gobert. That is a really good starting 5. Your next 5 is also really solid. The Wolves don't really have a quote unquote backup point guard. Shake Milton, I guess, if we're doing a 2 deep depth chart would be that if you're talking about your next 5. Shake Milton, Troy Brown Jr., Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Kyle Anderson, Naz Reid in the front court. And of course, you're staggering rotations. We'll get more in the weeds on that as we get further into the offseason. We get closer to the season, like actual minutes breakdowns. Like how many minutes is Nas going to play next to Kat? How many minutes will he play next to Rudy? How many minutes will he play next to Kyle Anderson in a smaller lineup? We're going to talk a little about that today related to Kyle Anderson, but we'll get like really in depth on this. Like how many minutes will Kat see and how many of those minutes will be at the 4 versus potentially at the 5? We'll do that with Nas. We'll do that with Kyle Anderson. We'll do it with some of these other guys as well. But the flexibility that Chris Finch has in the top 10 of his rotation, or I guess that is the rotation, the top 10 of his roster is really, really strong. And if Jordan McLaughlin is your 11th guy, if Josh Minot is effectively your 11th guy, like that's a pretty good rotation. And there's going to be some nights where there's guys hurt, there's foul trouble, there's matchups where you really feel like, hey, we need McLaughlin to operate the second unit, or we need Josh Minot's energy, his do stuff ability. I should really make that do stuff ability. Is that what make that one word, one phrase? Like there's going to be nights where that matters more. And that's just an example of how this roster has already improved so much. Let's talk a little bit more specifically about Kyle Anderson, because Slow-Mo was one of the best players on the Timberwolves last season. There's no two ways about it. And I know there were plenty of articles written about how he potentially was the best free agent signing in Timberwolves history last season. And you could make that argument and I know that, fans who look at rate-based stats are going to be like, he averaged 9 points and 5 rebounds last year. What are you talking about? Well, I mean, he was one of the best players on the Timberwolves last season. Like, where would the Wolves have been without Kyle Anderson? They would have been below 500. I'll tell you that much, because he stepped in and started. What did he start? 46 games last year, played in 69 games, started 46 for the Wolves, mainly because of the Karl-Anthony Towns injury. And like you would argue, besides maybe like a when healthy Cat, and talk about Anthony Edwards, who else was the best player on the Wolves? Like it was Ant and it was kind of Kyle Anderson. Like Rudy Gobert was a little bit disappointing. Cat was disappointing when he was healthy. Mike Conley only played 24 games in the regular season in a Wolves uniform. He was fantastic in a Timberwolves uniform, by the way. But like he's certainly in the top 3 or 4 players on the Wolves roster last year. And by default, started 46 games. He actually finished 4th on the Wolves in minutes played behind Ant, Jaden McDaniels, and Rudy Gobert. Each of those guys played at least 70 games. Kyle Anderson played in 69 games and was 4th in minutes played. So what's his role look like? Because he isn't going to be a starter, right? We already talked about, obviously, who the starters are, assuming everybody's healthy. McDaniels is healthy now. Cat's healthy. Kyle Anderson's going to be your 6th man. He's going to be your 6th man that ideally plays the 4, but you also just signed Naz Reid to this big deal. Last year, the Wolves started the season with Kyle Anderson effectively as the backup 4. So you saw Cat play, 2/3 of the game at the 4. And then for a third of the game, he'd slide to the 5. Rudy would sit on the bench. Maybe not a third of the game, maybe a third of his minutes, I should say. Cat's at the 5, Rudy's on the bench, and Anderson's at the 4. And Nas was a DNP-CD in 6 of the first 15 games or whatever stat I said the other day. What does that look like now? Now that you're giving Naz Reid $14 million a year for the next 2 to 3 years, that's going to look a little different. Naz Reid needs those minutes. That means he's your backup 4. Cat's still your backup 5. Kyle Anderson, there's going to be scraps left over in the front court for Kyle Anderson. But he's going to play, so that means he's going to play the 3. Now, over the course of his career, Kyle Anderson's teams have been less effective at him at the small forward spot. And I would argue he played more 3 when he was younger, like earlier in his career with San Antonio. When he did a little bit of it in Memphis, they were not successful. And I think part of that is because, he is a good defender, a very versatile defender. There's threes that can beat him off the dribble. And he's also not traditionally a great shooter. He had a very good shooting year, not a volume shooter, but percentage-wise, a good shooting year this year, a career shooting year in Minnesota. But because he's not a true floor spacer, he's not a catch-and-shoot three-point guy, at least doesn't have that reputation, and he's not a lockdown one-on-one defender on guards and smaller threes, those minutes aren't going to be as positive with Kyle Anderson at the 3. So I want to look a little bit at the lineup data from last year with Kyle Anderson and where he saw some of his success, what the Wolves lineups could look like this year with Kyle Anderson, and how Chris Finch finds a way to have successful Kyle Anderson minutes while still playing Naz Reid, Karl-Anthony Towns, Rudy Gobert as much as he'd like to. So we'll do all that here next. All right. So Kyle Anderson's minutes last year, the vast majority of them came at the 4 for Chris Finch and the Wolves. And that is that's his best position, right? We've already established that. There's plenty of data that points to him playing better at the 4 for his career. Last season, when he played at the 3, well, let me say it this way. The vast majority of his possessions came at the 4. We know that, right? In fact, let me see if I can find that. I have the percentage here somewhere, like the percentage of his minutes, and it depends on where you go. So according to Basketball Reference, 90% of Kyle Anderson's minutes last year came at the 4, 2% came at center, and 8% came at the 3. That's probably about right. I looked at a couple different sites, and that's kind of the quickest, dirtiest way to look at this. But I think it's fair to say 90% of his minutes came at the 4. Overall, in limited possessions, the Wolves actually weren't bad with him at the 3. In fact, when he played the 3 with Karl-Anthony Towns and Rudy Gobert, the Wolves actually had a plus 4.4 net rating. It was only about 150 possessions, which is a drop in the bucket. Like compared to his whole season, that's like a couple percentage points of his total, the totality of possessions that Kyle Anderson played on the floor. So this is Kyle Anderson at the 3 with Cat at the 4, Rudy at the 5. They were a net plus 4.4 and 150 possessions. We're going to see some of that this year. I mean, like if McDaniels is in early foul trouble, like you better believe if this is not a pie in the sky scenario. If you watch the Timberwolves last year, Jaden McDaniels picking up 3 fouls in the first or 2 fouls in the first 4 minutes is a very plausible scenario. I think Kyle Anderson is your first sub off the bench and he's going to play the 3. The Wolves will just see what happens. Like, no, he's not Jaden McDaniels at the point of attack, but he's a solid team defender. He's long, he's smart. He's a solid rebounder at the 3. Actually, a better rebounder than Jaden McDaniels at the 3. So you put him there, you see what happens. I think that sample size is small enough that you could convince me either way. Like, we don't know until the Wolves try it. And clearly, on some level, the Wolves are comfortable with it. If they thought this was a no-win situation, they may have thought differently about a Nas extension. Now, of course, the counter there is Anderson's only got 1 year in his deal. So you don't make a long-term decision based on one season of a guy like Kyle Anderson, who like they could always trade him at the deadline, right? If that doesn't work out. I think it's pretty unlikely, but that's an option, right? Like every team in the league probably has called the Wolves. I don't know this, but they probably all called the Wolves about Kyle Anderson, right? Teams are interested in Kyle Anderson. We saw those reports at the deadline. So if the Wolves ever wanted to pivot there, they could. And I'm not saying that's what they're going to do, but I want to be clear that that's always an option if this doesn't work out. Now, there's less possessions that Kyle Anderson played with Gobert and Naz Reid and Towns off the floor. Those were a little less successful, and even less possessions that he played with Towns and Reid with Gobert off the floor, and those were even less successful. It's all small sample. He barely played the 3 in Timberwolves lineups last year, and so that really, we just don't know what this is going to look like, but it's going to have to happen. Now, to be clear, things are never, like I said this earlier, things never play out exactly how you want them to on paper. I already listed the Wolves' top 10 players. We know there's going to be injuries. We know there's going to be a ton of nights where it's going to be Jaden McDaniels. It could be Karl-Anthony Towns. It could be Rudy. All 3 of those guys are foul prone. If one of them hits the bench early with 2 fouls, well, Naz Reid steps up and plays more at the 4 and maybe plays the backup 5. Like say Cat gets into foul trouble, Naz comes in as your backup 4. He slides to the 5 when Cat takes a breather and Rudy's in foul trouble. And then Kyle Anderson plays the 4, and you're back to what the Wolves were doing for a lot of last year anyway. So you're only one person in foul trouble or one injury away from things being right back to how they were before. And now you have a guy, Kyle Anderson, who's a 4 that can play the 3 because of your roster crunch. Naz, who's a 5 who can play the 4 because of your roster crunch. Self-inflicted roster crunch, yes. But the point is the overall depth is better. And the Wolves' depth at each individual position is better. Chris Finch wants a versatile rotation. He wants a versatile roster, and he's got that. That's pretty typical in today's NBA. But this is a truly flexible roster now that we see. Like the Wolves came into last year, Jordan McLaughlin was the backup point guard, and he's a point guard. He doesn't play anything else, right? He can't really play off the ball because of his size. He can't defend bigger players. That kind of pigeonholes you. Jalen Noel was a 2 that could play a little point, but he wasn't going to play the 3. You weren't going to have him defend the 3. And if you had the 2 of them on the floor together, you were limited defensively. Taurean Prince was best cast as a small ball 4 or a 3. He wasn't great at guarding 2s, and effectively now you've replaced him with 2 players, well, really 3, in Alexander Walker, Troy Brown, and Shake Milton. Collectively, they're replacing Prince and Noel. And you just improve your versatility. You improve the different types of lineups you can throw out there. We'll talk a little bit more about rotations and specific minute allocations like I alluded to earlier, but like what's Troy Brown's role look like? I mean, he's primarily a 3, but you also have Nickeil Alexander-Walker, who I guess will mostly play the 2. But is there room for all these guys in the rotation on a nightly basis? The answer is probably not. Like, I think Chris Finch probably wants a 9-man rotation. So one of these guys may end up out of it for more than a few minutes a game. But again, over the course of the season, we're going to see so many different takes on this lineup that the name of the game is versatility and true depth and veteran depth. Again, Troy Brown Jr., rotation minutes on a Western Conference Finals team last year. Shake Milton has played 5 seasons for the Philadelphia 76ers, and they've been really good over the past 5 years. And yeah, there's been times where he's been out of the rotation, but he's been a mainstay for 5 years for a good team. Nickeil Alexander-Walker, we saw his worth in the playoffs last year guarding Jamal Murray, in the play-in game especially guarding Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Kyle Anderson has this experience. Now all these Wolves players have playoff experience except for the rookies. So there's no question this roster is improved and the depth is improved. The main question is, what are these lineups? And it's going to be so hard to see this early because there'll be such a small sample and the data won't be very clear early in the season. But Kyle Anderson at the 3 is probably my number one storyline. If I had to just look at this roster now and tell you what am I watching most early in the season about this roster and the rotation, it's Kyle Anderson minutes at the 3, because he was one of your most effective 2 or 3 players throughout the year last year, consistent players. And you're asking him to play a position where traditionally he's not as impactful at the 3. And you have a big lineup. You want to play big. What does this look like? Because if you take one of your best players from last year and you put them in a position where they're not going to be one of your best players and you hurt some of your lineups that were your best last year, that's a tough look, right? Kyle Anderson's best lineups last year, a lot of them were, like I said, 90% of his minutes came at the 4, right? He had some good lineups where he was with Gobert. He had some good lineups where he was with Naz Reid. But oftentimes it was when he was at the 4. Almost all the time it was when he was at the 4. So what does this look like next year? Let's keep an eye on that in the fall. And it's something we'll revisit with frequency and certainly will come up again here later in the offseason. The rest of the week, again, we'll get into some summer league stuff because that's about to happen. So believe it or not, we're right into that. We'll talk about a little more roster talk too, because Jalen, we don't know what kind of contract Jalen Clark is going to sign. We don't know for sure exactly what the contract for Leonard Miller looks like either. But the Wolves still have 1 two-way slot open. They have the 2 roster spots open. So there's always the possibility that, say, it would more likely be Jalen Clark than Leonard Miller, but say Jalen Clark signs a 2-way, then you still have a roster spot you could bring back on Austin Rivers if you wanted to, or whoever else on a vet minimum deal. Or you just sign him to a deal. Obviously he's out until at least January, and you could sign somebody else to a 2-way. So the Wolves may keep some of that flexibility for a little while, but that's something to keep an eye on, as technically the Wolves still have that roster spot to sort out. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about Summer League. We'll talk about, some of this other minutes allocation here. And again, we're daily through the rest of the month. So plenty to get to and plenty that we will cover here at Locked On Wolves. So big thank you to those of you who make Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.